Hello, everyone. Welcome to a special episode of the Coach Support Show where science meets strategy. So, today we're going to be also interacting with the chat. We've got quite a big topic today. It's going to be a lot of just like crazy ideas and those kind of things. So, if you do have ideas and thoughts or questions that you want us to answer, please put them in the chat, either YouTube or Twitch. And of course, we didn't do an episode last week because, Watson, you were away.
I was in Lisbon. So my first trip to Lisbon, also first trip ever to Portugal, as part of a European project called the eHealth Project, which is looking to promote health and physical activity in esports. One of the perks of the trip, just shortly relevant for the audience, was we got to attend the Blast Open premiere in Lisbon, and it was fantastic. I mean, Counter-Strike, it's not a game I've worked a great deal in, but being able to be on the floor in a packed arena, watching a few giant teams going head to head, and watching Mouse and watching Vitality play was really, really fun. And I was struck once again by certainly like how passionate people are in this space, and how that's contagious. So you're in that environment for half a second, you hear the fans, and you I don't have a team in Counter-Strike, but you naturally gravitate towards them because of the energy in the room. It took some of my colleagues who weren't so familiar with esports by a little bit of a shock there. Like, wow, this is, you fill arenas with these games, which was fantastic. And again, just how far we've come as like in esports. So I'm not going to claim I've been in since the beginning, but certainly when I was touching, with research, I was getting into esports and the professional side of it and performance. There was still some discussion around the role of coaches and things like that, and being there in person and seeing the mechanisms, the structures, the coaching staff, the performance support staff behind the scenes, and how they have. There is a fingerprint on how we do business in esports performance now. So there was like physical activity. There was you could see some breathing exercises. You could see some tricks of the trade, like the hand warmers on the desk, things like that. And it was interesting to see how far we've come in that sense. So yeah, I had a great time, and it was great to see Mouse win. I was there with Tobias Schultz from the Esports Research Network, who's a big Mouse fan. He's followed them from the very beginning, and I got into it and I enjoyed it, and yeah. It was just it was fun to be live and in person at something for a while, so that was good.
Yeah, I love the atmosphere that you sometimes get at events. I think it's also partly due to the fact that it's an arena. The example I always used to give when trying to explain it to people who haven't been involved with esports before, and just like you say, it doesn't necessarily. It's obviously better if you're a massive fan of one of the teams, but not necessarily. Sometimes there's something there, something going on. And because you're in this closed space, I think it's much better. So I always used to say, I've seen England beat France at Twickenham in the last like 2 minutes of the game, like in the dead space, like after 80 minutes. And actually, if you were to ask me my favorite crowd experience, it probably still would be a CWL event like COD World League that I don't even play COD, and I wasn't involved. I was there filming a team Splice, but they had a bunch of UK players and they got knocked into the lower bracket, and they just played back-to-back games against these massive American organizations and just beat them like one by one by one. And just it was absolutely wild. Like the people involved with Splice, a bunch of them were just openly like weeping on the front row. Like it was just they didn't even win, they came second, but just the energy and like the whole place was like fully shaking because there was 3,000 4,000 people, but it's in like a closed room. It wasn't even a big arena, it was just like a closed room kind of thing. And so it's just like it was just so intense and really, really fun. And like I say, I don't like Call of Duty particularly. I was there filming with them, and it was
contagious though. Fantastic. Yeah, that's great. The production value as well in the arena we were in was awesome. Like fireworks going off every time a bomb was detonated. So I think even if you're naive to gaming and esports and you were there, you're like, this is high value. Like this is high quality. So yeah, they did a great job getting everyone involved. So yeah, it was fun. So a bit of a departure from our usual league centric chats, but yeah, it was really, really fun. And of course, you can't help but think about the performance pressure on the players and how they work through it. And Yeah, it was a great moment. I forget Vitality IGL's name, but he got a headshot against the odds to win the round, and there was a moment where he like waved to the opposition, and it was a good moment. So yeah, fun. Anyway, coach support.
Yeah, fixing EU. That's the title. Now, before we actually get into this, I do want to say, and I think this is actually maybe it can also be a topic. It can also be one of the things that I think we should fix about EU, is that the reason we are doing this and the reason we first said, okay, we should talk about this, is because during First Stand, the first tournament, this is going to be very league centric. So apologies to anyone who got too excited by that CS opening. I think EU CS is doing all right. They don't need our help. But basically, during First Stand, there were a few people who made some tweets saying how the system is kind of failing and what are things we can do to fix it. And that was because it looked very much like EU, KC in this case, was about to go out last place behind the Taiwanese region, behind it and NA again. Over the last few years, that's happened a few times. And it really looked like it was going to be our kind of worst international showing ever. But after these tweets went out, things changed a bit. And actually, KC ended up coming second. And you could argue it was either our best or second best showing ever. So yes, before G2 had made it to the finals of MSI, but they didn't play against the favorite of the tournament. The favorite of the tournament got knocked out by NA because they literally didn't even look at the enemy team. That's a separate matter. So the point that I wanted to acknowledge and talk about at the beginning, which can start to be a bit of a serious one, is that firstly, it's a bit silly for us to say this, considering this is the EU's best performance in 5 years. So maybe EU doesn't need to be fixed suddenly, but who knows? But the other thing that I think is really important is that we still don't quite understand, the decision makers in esports, I feel, still don't quite understand how big a role randomness plays in a competitive sport, and especially a competitive sport like League of Legends or just life in general, and all this stuff that's outside of your control. So I actually haven't had a chance yet, but I really wanted to speak to someone like Rhea, who's the head coach of KC, and just say, how do you approach a tournament like this? How do you approach reflecting on it? Because yes, of course, KC did loads of things really, really well. But if you change things that are completely out of their control, it would have been the worst performance EU has ever done. Matches that they weren't in, 2 or 3 matches needed to go the right way, and they all went the right way. So if CFO had lost, KC would be out, and everyone would be they all need to be fired. They're the worst ever. This is an embarrassment. For a decade, people are going to remember that one time you came very bottom of a tournament, which has never happened before. Whereas now, again, they did a lot of things unbelievably well, and that's all you can do. But now they'll be thought of as okay, this is are we as good as G2 2019 now? We're back at the top, fighting for titles in the final, all that kind of thing. So yeah, I mean, firstly, do you have thoughts on this, this thing of randomness? For me, I don't think, I guess the way that I would describe it, because I have talked about this before with a few other people, is that it's we should live as if there's not a huge element of randomness in what we do. But we do have to acknowledge that there is, and especially for me, if we're decision makers. So I've mentioned to you just before we start. I think it's a bit sad is maybe not the right word, but I can't think of a better one. When I hear teams make decisions based on how we placed in a certain tournament, seeming to completely ignore the fact that it could be completely random. So G2 said they swapped players based on how well they placed at Worlds, not how well they performed, how well they placed. And it just so happens in the Switch stage, they matched up against 3 teams who were in the top 4. So you could have been, let's say there was no luck, you could have been the 4th best team and you would have still come 3rd. Or again, another random example before I throw it to you. Sorry, I've gone on for too long. But
It's great.
In the World Cup, Rugby World Cup, I think this is true. England came into the World Cup this time seeded 8th, because we'd had a bad few years. But because the seeding of the World Cup is done 2 years before, they ended up coming 3rd, and all the results went as expected. So are they the 3rd best team? Because as it so happened, on one side of the bracket, you had the rank 1, rank 2, rank 3, rank 4, or something like that, all stayed on the same side of the bracket. Because when they were drawn 2 years before, they weren't rank 1, rank 2, rank 3, rank 4. And they looked like the best teams in the tournament, but they all knocked each other out. And then the one time where we played against someone who was higher seed than us, we lost. So how do you think, especially as decision makers, but just in general, we should approach this thing of randomness before we get into the tweets, which are also very interesting?
Yeah, it's definitely been something I've had to wrestle with quite a bit over the last 10 years. So some people might be aware I've been doing a PhD in sport coaching for 10 years. In the last 5 years, it's been focused on esports. And at the early days, I thought coaches controlled a lot about their team and their team's performance. And over the last 10 years, with some of my own thinking, but a lot of research that's emerged in this area, it's because it's obvious that's not the case. The coach doesn't control everything about how their team performs. And in fact, when you think about just the facts are you're competing against another team, both teams are trying to control performance, but they're actually contesting it. So you are not on the face of that information, you are clearly not in complete control of the performance in the game. And so from that thought process, I've been wrestling with this idea of how much do we have control over? And very quickly you come into this idea of randomness and what's outside the limits of your control. And a lot of that is luck. So luck of the draw, like you've mentioned. And all sorts of other situational factors, but also emotional, psychological factors around, we wake up one day and things aren't quite clicking and we're not quite aware why. Maybe it was something that set us off into a negative mood from earlier in the week, things like that. There's a lot of luck involved. I think when you're working with coaches, the coach that believes they are in control, in my experience, has often then sought to correct mistakes and fix things that they perceive were an error on the part of players because maybe they were told one way of doing something and they didn't do that, therefore it's a mistake that needed fixing, when in fact it might just be that it was unable to be done that way because of pure chance, the way things landed or the way things happened or the way things in league maybe appeared on the map, for example. And it's difficult. And I think when you're talking about coaches, we don't like this idea of relinquishing control, but actually I think it's powerful. Maybe this is the topic for a whole other podcast. It's more about how can we influence, and in our realms of control, what influence can we have and what's achievable. And so actually when I saw this discussion pop up and I saw all the responses to tweets that were put out and the tweets you've highlighted, I think there is still a rather, dare I say it, naive impression that it's certainly prominent on social media, whether it's prominent throughout esports, maybe, but there is this idea that we are in complete control of our performance and our circumstances and our situation. And it's very difficult to unpack why that's not the case. And it does take I think, for me, some fancy YouTube videos to clarify thoughts on this. But just that, we've gone back and forth over one that's really important, but just the sample size issue. So with a few games, luck is going to play a bigger factor if two teams go head to head in those results. With a larger sample size of games, skill is going to be increasingly more of a factor, and luck will be less of a factor. So you'd hope that the outcome is more reflective of what is actually true in terms of who is better in those matchups. So, but in the esports tournaments that we're reflecting on, the sample size is minute. There aren't many games, and so drawing these conclusions and making these very grand statements, maybe for the purposes of social media, but maybe there's a belief there that things need to be fixed off the back of 5 games or 4 games. It's interesting, but yeah, I think maybe the main point there is it's difficult to get to grips with the role that luck plays and where we see it. So,
yeah,
what are your thoughts on that?
Well, yeah, and I agree, and I think again, like I said, I think it's different how you should acknowledge it and how you should act.
Yeah.
And it's also different if we're talking about coaching as to if we're talking about, well, it could be the coach, but maybe like GM or head of LOL or whatever, like planning for the future. Because, for example, you could do absolutely everything right for a season, and then your star player gets ill before the big match and you lose it. Should you think about that like you lost it, or like we don't know, or like you won if it looked like you were the favorite? you know, or you were really close, but your star player was literally like falling off his chair, kind of thing. So we, for example, our top laner was really ill during the finals. Now, luckily for the decision making, it didn't look very close. So maybe you could say, well, it was obviously never going to work. But if we'd have been a bit better, and that could have been a factor, because I mean, all of us caught it afterwards, and I did message him the week after, like, if you had what I had, you played so well, because I literally couldn't. It took me like half an hour to read an A4 piece of paper because I just COVID or something. But anyway, the point is that sometimes it's maybe a bit easier to identify like what should the takeaways be, but then sometimes it's really hard. Like here, what should the takeaways be for KC? I mean, we are getting off topic, but I just wanted to acknowledge that up front. Like, it's weird for us to have this conversation considering it's now coming off the back of the best performance in a long time. But I do think that's a good first step. The people who are making decisions, we need a better way of making decisions than results, especially when results have tiny sample size. And currently, from what I see, even with the top teams, results seem primarily the factor that we take into account. And I can see why, because if we don't have anything better, you know, it might be the worst way to do it just ahead of all the other ways to do it. It could be one of those situations. But that's just something to say. Should we get into these tweets then?
Just one other thing before we get into them. One would be the other side of the coin is not that when we think about luck and randomness, it's not just in terms of losing and EU is terrible. It's also like impossible things happen all the time. And maybe there are some football fans, English football fans on the stream, but you think about the case of Leicester City, a football club in the UK, fairly small, but they won the Premier League not so long ago. And if you put yourself in the sort of the shoes of the owner of that club, upon winning the Premier League and everyone believing it was unexpected, would you then decide to invest in the world's biggest stadium and like upgrade everything because you think that's going to be maintained, or would you think, well, we had a bit of luck there,
sell all your players for like big money because they were way over that? I mean, that's actually literally the same thing happened in League of Legends. So DRX, massive upset, won World Championships, and then all their players left because they were going to leave anyway. And they left on absolutely massive salaries, like new big offers. Now, as it so happens now, one of them especially is now on the best team in the world and he looks incredibly good. But still, for a while, it looked like you've all been had by this result. You've all been, the randomness of this result has absolutely cost people millions and millions. That's quite an interesting one, but it could be randomness in the other direction as well.
Yeah, if inflated salaries, perception that they are awesome. And it's not to say things they maybe had systems that were maturing and were doing really well. But I think it's just the speed at which that happens is not, it doesn't, yeah.
Yeah, I mean, you showed me this video that's fantastic that people should look up. I don't know if you want to maybe add it in the description or something like that. If you send it to me, I'll make sure it's there. About the randomness of sport or luck. They use the word luck. I prefer randomness, I think, for other reasons. But anyway, if League of Legends was on that scale, it would be, I would think, much more towards the luck end than anything else. Because it's also like, it was the right meta for the DRX players. The game changed, and so it really rewarded people who happen to like champions like Akali and Silas, and their mid laner, who is the person who is now unbelievably good, best team. They won first stand. But still, for a few years afterwards, it looked like he could only play two champions. And it just so happened that they were the two best champions of the patch on that one patch. So what do you do with that? What do you do about, like, how can you ever hope to actually have some solid takeaways in this world?
Yeah. If Morgana was suddenly a relevant champion, you might see me appearing on an ERL team sometime. But that's not going to happen, right? I shouldn't get a contract because of that. That scale is really interesting in the video. I will share it. It's just thinking about how much of your performance and the variation in your performance will be down to skill and luck. And some sports you can reduce luck down quite far. So if it's swimming, you're in your own lane and it's an individual contest, skill will play a big role. There will be some factors that influence it, but largely, it
Still
could
get
be a
sick
crowd that
before,
turns
yeah.
up. Yeah, exactly. But it's going to be, the influence of luck will be less because you are in control of a lot more than in a team invasion game, and particularly a digital one with random occurrences. So yeah, luck in League, wow, I think it's a huge part of it. And as you say, patches, wow.
And there's not, like, it's an imperfect information game. That's why it's always really interesting to me to compare like chess to League, because of course chess is always the one on that far end of the scale. And even then, to be honest, the reason Magnus Carlsen, the greatest chess player of all time, probably, didn't defend his world title was because he said, because of the format, which is only best of 10, there's too much luck involved, basically. So I've got nothing to gain, because if I win, it's like business as usual. And if I lose, which I can because there's luck, then it's an absolute tragedy. So I'm just not going to bother, basically. I mean, that's one of the reasons. So even with that, there's still sample size issue. But the thing with chess is that you can see all the enemy pieces. And yet the better player will, I mean, maybe not if you're talking about, I don't know, Hikaru and Magnus or something like that, but someone who's a super GM in 2800 will always be 100% of the time someone who's like a normal grandmaster or an international master, which is just crazy. There's just so much, I think, in League that you just happen to walk at this right time to see the opponent walking into a position to gank you, or you happen to not walk that way, and then they killed you and got Baron, and then the whole game changes. And all these kind of things, like, it just gets so complicated so fast. So I just think, bringing it back to the fixing EU topic,
right?
Find any other thing than results, if possible, if you're in charge of long-term planning for an esports organization. And hearing that some of the best teams, the reason they say they replace players is because of our result in a certain tournament, is always for me a bit of a warning sign for long-term future, like 5-10 years, if this, assuming League of Legends carries on and all this kind of stuff.
Yeah, so I mean, just to clarify the scene, we think that it's an emphasis on the results, right? That's it. We're weighing a lot of how we evaluate a team's performance based on what they achieve in terms of wins and losses.
I would try and find anything other than results to be the biggest thing. And sure, you can think about results a bit, but even just to quantify the results, again, I'll take this G2 example. In the Swiss stage, they happen to be matched up against 3 teams who finished in the top 4. So, of course, they're not going to tell you everything publicly. Potentially, I mean, there were rumors they were replacing players before the tournament, of course. So maybe it's all just a bit of a way to save face and a bit of a way to save face for the players. I don't know, whatever. But let's say we just take everything at face value, and you swap players because we got knocked out in the Swiss stage, which is not good enough. So we have to swap players. That's where I have a bit of a problem, because you could have literally been the 4th best team at the tournament and you would have still got knocked out in the Swiss stage because of the draw that you had. And so if they played badly, sure, you can use that. They couldn't handle the pressure of a big event, or they performed really badly when it mattered, or anything like that. Those are all fine, completely great reasons. But you could have, if there was no luck, let's say, you could still be the 4th best team and you would get knocked out in Swiss stage. If the only randomness was the draw, you still would have got knocked out. So that's where I have a bit of a problem. Because, publicly you say you want to win, therefore it shouldn't matter because we have to beat everybody. And that's fine. And that's a good thing to say on your social media account, on Twitter. But to actually make long-term decisions based on that's where I think it's a bit of a mistake. And again, I have a massive caveat of, I don't really think this is actually why they made the decision, but they say that it is. So that's where I have the kind of problem with.
Yeah, definitely. Yeah, for me, I'm looking at it more and more through. It's very hard in esports in particular to really understand what matters for performance, because we don't have this term. got to stop using it like this, but we don't have the sample size to really understand what matters for performance in esports. So we have to date, and this is beyond me, this is industry figures, this is researchers, we have used what we think matters in sports contexts, and it may or may not be so important in esports. So the effective age is coming up still, and I think it reflects a fairly poor understanding of cognition and performance, and actually what matters in terms of esports performance. So to articulate that in perhaps a slightly more straightforward way, sure, some things, some cognitive functions might drop off a little bit after late 20s, early 30s, but other aspects will mature and improve.
And even that, it's already late 20s, by the way. You're not saying from the moment you hit 20. So
it may even, I think, it may even be in, I think it's even 30s. I think it's mid 30s for the ones that actually really matter. I think it might be mid 30s, but we don't have a really complete puzzle of like what matters for performance in terms of cognitive functions. So I think as you age, there are improvements in emotional regulation, but I think everyone in esports would acknowledge that we have to maintain control over our emotions to be good in game. But we don't talk about, well, in that case, someone who's pretty grounded and 45 years old has an advantage in that respect. We go to the low-hanging fruit of things like, I don't know if this one specifically, but earlier on it was reaction time, and it, we made this blanket statement that reaction time drops off, therefore we can't be a good gamer beyond 26 or something. And it's
you can be an F1 driver, but you can't play League of Legends.
Right. So, a great example. Something else is compensating there that's really valuable, or it's not declining as much as we think it is. So, for me, it's hard to separate it from, are we still recycling those arguments for social media attention, or is it that we, as an industry, we really haven't got to grips with the relative contribution of these like cognitive functions? But I think it does reflect that we don't have a very informed puzzle of like the perfect attributes for performance in League, because you've mentioned Faker to me before and how he's going strong and he's perceived to be an older player in the game, and obviously we haven't got him into a lab to study all of his like psychological and cognitive attributes, but it's like he probably combines a great deal of knowledge with some other characteristics that are really, really important for performance, and they're probably not your basic mechanical skills. There's probably something else there that's going on. So it's I think we can't say for sure. I can't dismiss these ideas, but it's like, I don't think until we have a great idea of really what matters, and I think we'd be surprised. I think there could be high performers way later than we currently see.
I think there's a couple of comments from YouTube that I want to kind of throw in, because I think they both sum up things very well. Like someone said, since no team effectively measures a player's growth, that's why they almost have no choice but to use results. So on this randomness thing, and I do think it's that. I do think it's because we don't have a better way to do it. I just want us to put more effort into finding a better way to do it. That would be very useful, I think, and it doesn't seem to be on anyone's real agenda. And another person had the comment of Carrigan, who won a major when he was 32 in CSGO, and I think
PGL Major Antwerp. I was there.
Anyway, but also that's like, I don't think even the most diehard League fan ever would argue that League of Legends is a higher reaction-based game. Or again, I don't think anyone would argue that F1 driving doesn't need better reaction. Alonso's 43 or 44 or whatever. Like this is not something that, I don't think League of Legends is very reaction based as a game. But even if it was, it's not going to be as much as these other things where we're seeing but we'll get a bit more into the age thing later, because I do want to. We'll talk about that when we talk about the EMEA Masters thing, because I do think that conversation is something that maybe should be had, although I think it's almost it's a less serious conversation. Maybe that's showing my bias around that conversation. but I think it's a less serious conversation than some of these other things. So, as we said, that was a very long preamble, but we wanted to look at a couple of tweets, especially that caught my eye. I don't know if there's more. If there is more, by the way, do feel free to put them in the chat. We're going to look at one from Zoxy and one from Duke. I think let's just talk. I mean, obviously, I know Duke, so I'm going to be a bit biased there, probably. But I want us to talk about them. Hopefully, we can kind of disagree about them. So if there are any people who disagree as well in the chat, I want to see if we can get. We have a danger, obviously, of just agreeing with each other for 2 hours while talking about this. So which one do you want to look at first? Should we look at Zoxy's one first? Because I think that was actually
Yes,
the one that first came
Academy.
out. Yeah. So here's a list of things that this person reckons will be a way to save EU. Because at this stage, like I said, he was about to perform the worst ever. Even if EU does perform better, I do think there's actually some serious issues that we've had. I think LEC has been very weak for a while. I do think all that stuff is true. So, first one, mandatory for LEC orgs to have academy teams. It's kind of 2 points in his first point, but I'll put that out there first. What do you think about this idea that it's mandatory for orgs to have an academy team?
A sigh, unfortunately, because great in theory, but what do we expect an academy to do? And that's where it falls apart, because what we're expecting an academy to solve things. So we're therefore expecting that just by being part of an academy, you will dramatically increase your in-game skill and ability to perform at the highest level. And what does that require? Well, that requires academies to be optimal places to go and do that. And I'm not saying, I have some thoughts about academies historically. I was part of the NLC when we were competing against a couple of them.
I was in one of those.
Oh yeah, true. Yeah,
yeah, I can speak to that.
And we were trying to break the academies. Like we were trying to finish in amongst the academies. I think in the end we finished fourth, and they finished first and second. But it was we're assuming the academy, being part of an academy, does something for you as a player, rather than actually, I think historically academies have just had the means to recruit the better players. But what happens when you're part of the academy? And we know from sport that there are elite academies in sport, but they provide things I don't think we're seeing yet in esports. So they're providing fantastic holistic support from specialists that is woven together that perfectly meets the needs of those individual players in terms of their growth in game and out of game. Now, we could imagine that might happen in League, but bearing in mind we don't know what really matters, we don't know that we can guarantee the support will be there, and then not even mentioning the resources it would take to deliver that for some of these LEC teams. And it could also be at the end of the day that maybe, unfortunately, it could be the case. It's unlikely to be the case, but it could be the case. But that for short-term performance in League, you need to be training or scrimming 8 to 12 to 14 hours a day. Maybe that's the best way of getting better at the game, but we wouldn't want to prescribe that because it's not best for you long-term or as a human. So it's just, I think we're assuming that the academy thing solves things without really understanding what's necessary to be provided.
Yeah. I mean, the thing for me, the short version of this is this used to be the case and it was complete failure.
Right.
Because the academies were just run terribly. So if you could prescribe 10 academies that are run well and people running the whole LOL project for an org that has a main team and an academy team, then I think it's great. But if you force people to do it, mostly they're just going to do it terribly, which is what happened. And I mean, I'll use a couple of examples. One of which I can be specific about, and one of which I won't use names, even though I guess probably you could work it out. When I was on Excel, I think the way that we used our academy team was absolutely terrible. We basically, just like you said, were just, unfortunately wasn't able to convince anyone else of this at the time, but basically we just were spending way more money than anyone else in the NLC except from Fnatic Academy. And the goal of the academy was to buy the best players that we could buy to do as well in the NLC as possible, because no one set a goal. So that's the goal, like by default, because if you're the coach of the academy, you want to then get a new job. So you want to do well in the league, because again, we've got this massive focus on results. So Actually, it all ties together. I hadn't even realized that. And at one point on their Excel Academy, there were 3 players, so 3 out of 5, who not only had already played in the LEC, but they had already played in Excel's LEC team. So they'd been demoted from the Excel LEC team, the contract had run out, and then they'd been rehired by their academy team. So without a massive change in the main team, it's not like everything restructured and maybe in the new structure they might have a chance. So for me, okay, maybe if you're being super specific about it, maybe there are 1 or 2 cases where it's like, okay, this person just needs more time to develop and then we'll bring them back up again. But that wasn't the case. It was literally like, this person is not good enough, so we're kicking them. And then a different person is like, well, this is the best player on the market, so we'll take them. And they were being paid loads of money. I know, because we were talking to one of them at one time, and he needed 3 times the budget for the position. That was even competing like LFL was competing with at the time. So for me, it's like you're saying for these players in our own specific environment with the performance processes that we have in the main team, these people are not good enough or not the type of player that we want. So why are they sitting on the academy and also being paid loads and loads of money? Another example, which I say I won't use names, is I was actually not working in coaching at the time. I was working in video, but I was talking to our academy coach who was quite new to coaching, and he'd done really well and a former player. And he was talking about the fact that he was quite nervous to do like best of 5s and playoffs and stuff like that. And I was asking, okay, what does the head coach of the main team say? And he was like, I don't know. And I was like, can he help you at all? It's like, I've spoken to him once on the first day I arrived, and it's now 6 months in. And I was like, this is what academies were. This is what mandatory academies were. And so I actually think that the way people are using academies is starting to get much, much better. I think BDS are starting as of this split to do good things. I would say last split, when they had the most successful academy team ever, I think it was a complete waste of everything. They had the most expensive roster in ERLs, and they were really, really good. And then all the players ran out of contract and went to the LEC, and so they didn't sell them to the LEC or anything. And a bunch of them didn't go to BDS. So I think as an ERL team, it was amazing if you can afford it. As a academy team, it wasn't a particularly successful year, I would say. But they're really changing this year. And I know that a lot of the stuff like Vitality, for example, are doing, I know Mac is really interested in working across teams and doing like mixed scrims and doing all this stuff and like sharing the learning across everything. And of course, KC is absolute, probably top example just by how they approach things. They're actually doubling down. They've got a 3rd team now, specifically designed. I mean, they haven't quite managed to do this yet, but specifically designed to find people who are like, they want to target people who are like really young to start to bring them into it early on, like specifically looking for that. So they have 3 different teams now. That for me is actually in a way better than mandatory academies, because you get people with academies who want to do academies, and you get people running ERL teams who want to run ERL teams. Whereas if you are forced to have an academy and you don't know what to do with it, you just waste loads of money. It gives you no return in any way. And then as soon as you're allowed to cancel it, you do. And that's what half the LEC teams did. As soon as they're allowed to cancel it, they did, because they probably actually saw no return on investment for academies. So for me, mandating them, if I could somehow mandate people run academies well, then absolutely, I think that'd be the best thing to ever happen for EU. And I think in 5-10 years, it would be top of my list if I could make stuff happen. But just to mandate them is not enough, because we just ruin them again.
I would also have to add that to your mandate, though. We'd also have to mandate that the community accepts that they're not meant to win. Like that we'd have to all swallow that. We'd all have to swallow, like, you can't judge the academy by whether it wins or not. That's not the point.
Yeah.
And we're not there yet. As a community, we would, this academy team was put together and it finished, last and didn't win a game. So therefore, terrible academy, terrible players, get a new roster. Like that's how I could imagine currently we perceive it. And
that's actually, that'd be really interesting, because again, if we use KC as like the best example, obviously again, they have 3 tiers. So their second tier, because it's a franchise system, the second tier is going to be their best French team. So you could argue that actually performance is important, although they did really run it like an academy. They actually won as well, but they won and then their players got sold to the LEC. So one of them did. And so eventually, if you keep running an academy team well and you keep winning, you will eventually start to not win. You should, hopefully, based on the rest of the other teams. And so it'll be really interesting where that changes, because of course so much of their brand is about how unbelievably successful they've been. So much of their appeal is about how great they've been, although obviously not all of it, considering there were people who didn't really understand the French scene, who thought when they came 10th in the LEC they'd lose loads of fans, and like, obviously not. It's obviously not just about winning, but it is still a huge factor. So that will be an interesting thing to kind of to pay attention to. But for now, they're doing both. They're winning in the LFL with academy players who they're then selling to LEC and funding their academy. So it's perfect.
That's a really cool measure, though. Like player advancement. That's a good sign. I mean, we use that a lot in like English Premier League football, for example. Like, do you graduate your academy players to the main team? That's one of many indicators. So if they can lose, still graduate players, that's a great sign.
Yeah. That for me is a great internal measurement, like an absolutely fantastic internal measure. If I'm ahead of LOL, for example, somewhere, and I've got 2 or 3 teams, let's say 2, and I put someone in charge as the head coach of the academy, what was happening and does still happen in several academies is that head coach has a 1-year contract. And so no matter what you tell them, what they have to do is perform as best as possible in summer, because they're then going to leave and go somewhere else. But what I would suggest is have a longer contract and specifically tell them, we're going to judge you based on how many players in this 4-year period go from the academy to a main team. And you'll get raises based on that, or you'll get the downside that we have is that there's nothing you can offer a coach almost ever that's better than an LEC spot. So that's the downside. I mean, that will start to change more when there are people nowadays who are starting to choose to not be in LEC. If you'd rather live in France or you'd rather live in Spain, and all those kind of things. But anyway, I do think that's a fantastic way to measure, and it would have been a great approach for academy.
Yeah, we have a question, I think, in the Twitch chat, but on the coaching standpoint as well, it's where we can also see a little bit of immaturity, in the sense of like not old immaturity in the esports scene, that we tend not to have coaches that are specialists at development. So in sport, you'll have coaches at every different level who are specialists in some sense at that level. So you have the under 18 coach who's just a fantastic youth coach, but who wouldn't necessarily fixate on head coach of the main senior team. And I think in esports, we're not there yet, partly because like when you go off tier 1, there is instability. So who would want to stay in that environment? But if you had people that, for this third team of, was it BDS or KC? KC, yeah. If you had like the third team you appointed someone who was just a wonderful character building, team cohesion building coach, and they were happy to stay at that level, and you had the funds to give them a contract that was stable for a certain amount of years, like that, you could see specialists at those lower levels in terms of coaching that are happy doing that job of development, and they can get the most. This would be a metric that we'd love to have, which we obviously can't, but it would be like, does the coach at that level get the best out of them then, and give them the skills to go on and improve? Like those are we can't ever get them. We have to infer them. But like, if we had coaches that were great at doing that, rather than everyone's like thinking they have to get to their ceiling as quick as possible and move on.
I was actually talking to an organization about this, I won't say which one, at the beginning of the year, one of the big LEC organizations, and they have a way that they've developed that they think gives them a really good assessment, kind of just like a numbers assessment of players. And they were saying the problem is it's really hard now to judge coaches. That's the thing that we still really struggle with. And I think actually one thing that would be very interesting, we were talking about the results thing before, is doing like a kind of, again, actually, maybe it doesn't make any sense because the sample size is too small. But if the sample size is bigger, like expected outcome, given our metrics of how good the players are versus actual outcome. Because this does tie a bit into the question from the chat, which is there's Agarin's team has just started winning games without really scrimming. So basically what's up there? That's the question. And for me, scrimming is absolutely important. we just lost both our games, and we wouldn't have if we'd have scrimmed more. I'm 100% sure of that. Like if we could scrim more and the enemy teams don't scrim more, I could tell you that we would 100% win after probably even another week of scrims. But of course, they'll keep scrimming as well. They'll keep getting better. But that doesn't mean that bad players are bad if they don't scrim. So we did very little scrims and were much worse because of it. But for example, last split, actually, even on our first scrims, we were really, 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 really good. So it's a lot about the luck of how things fit together. You have much less control as a coach or even as a teammate when you don't practice with your other teammates. So if everyone's just spamming solo queue, you can do the beginning part. And there will always be a ceiling, because as soon as you match up against players who do that, but also practice together, they will beat you every time. So, well, every time minus the luck ones.
Right.
So yeah, I think scrimming is still really important. I don't think it's as important as people make out. I think especially VOD reviews after scrims aren't as important as people make out. But I do think practice is important. But it's like if you took the T1 roster and they didn't scrim, they would win EMEA Masters. So it's just until you get to that level of, so for Agron's team in this case, if you start matching up against people who have the same kind of firepower on the roster plus they practice, it's going to be hard. But for now, they're very, very good players and also very experienced players. And so it's also very tiny sample size and short period. Okay, so that's the very first thing with the majority of Academy. I've realized we're coming up to 50 minutes and haven't actually got through the first point even. So the next one is there should be an LEC League 1 and LEC 2 League 2 with 10 academies. Now, for me, obviously it's weird in this case because I don't know why. I don't know why this person thinks this. So it might be something I'm not understanding about how they think this would work. I think that would be really, really sad. I think the better thing to do would be to find a way to get rid of the LEC and put those LEC teams in ERLs. Because I think it's fantastic that we have a massive wide tier 2 system. And I think that's why we have still, despite mismanagement a lot, been able to find new talent and develop talent and all that kind of thing. And okay, Calist probably wouldn't be the same situation as before, but he joined KC before they joined the LEC, right? So I think maybe only just. But if he'd have joined another massive team, he could have also, he came up playing LFL2, not for KC or anything like that. Like identifying that talent and getting competition across all these different areas, and the fact that there are 30 good ERL teams, I think is much, much better than having a league of 10 where you'd hopefully have 10 good ERL teams or equivalent if they're academies. But if you look at the LEC, I don't think you'd say we really have the best 50 players in the LEC or the best possible 10 teams. So for me, I think narrowing that stuff down, I think would be very strange. I don't really see the positive. Can you see the positive in that, like narrowing down the tier 2 system?
So the way you read it, it would be that some of the tier 2 teams would be elevated to an LEC 2.
Well,
and
I mean, in reality, everyone else would be demoted because LEC 2 would just be the ERLs. So rather than having like the LFL, the LVP, NLC, all those things separately, you would just have you'd have 2 leagues that are probably, because they're all academy, they're franchised, so they're locked, organizationally at least. And it's like the best and the next best.
Yeah.
So it's just narrowing down the system. And I would guess the reasoning is that it's a narrow system in Korea, and Korea are good. That's why, because Korea has the top league of 10 teams, then it has the Academy League of all 10 teams, then it has the Challenger League of all 10 teams. It has like tiers, but they're just 10 rosters each. But I would argue they're not good because of that. I think the system is there because of the system of the environment that they're in, rather than anything else.
Exactly.
It's not 30 different countries as well.
Yeah, exactly that. I mean, that's the thing. For me, I'm looking at it from a talent development perspective. Like, what would that do a better job of in terms of developing talent and avoiding teams getting through to the international tournaments with a high degree of luck rather than a high degree of skill. And so for me, the answer would be just to expand LEC to more teams, to have more games, to have a better opportunity for teams to reach the top of the LEC through skill rather than luck, and then go on to represent us in international. And just by doing that, you're more likely to have the skilled teams competing at the highest level and can get a better result, assuming the draw isn't against them. So I don't see how having a second sort of international division has any bearing on talent production and delivery at the highest level. And actually thinking about you had Kiao, who you brought across from Slovenia to France, and he just finished runners up in the EMEA Masters. Yeah.
No, I mean they did really well in EMEA Masters, but I mean that happens a lot in ERLs.
It's reflective of the like talent pool.
The one thing that's slightly weird in ERLs is they do still have like LTR rules. You have to be from that region, which used to make a lot of sense when people actually lived in the region and it was all gaming houses. But now it's mostly remote, other than a few places. That does seem a little bit weird. Like the French teams have to have 3 French players, or probably 2 French players and 1 French sub, who happens to just be any French person who's above the certain rank. So that kind of thing is a little strange, I guess. And maybe if I'm trying to give my best argument as to why reducing the second, the tier 2 would be good, is that so that you're not taking people based on, you're not building, you could build probably better teams, but I think a tier 2 system shouldn't be about creating the 10 best teams. It should be about gathering the however many best players and giving them strong competition. For example, EMEA Masters is always going to be a stronger thing of competition, probably. Like more pressure than the playoffs of LEC Div 2, I would think, because you have the added fun and pressure of representing your region and all those kind of things.
Right.
But
I don't see the link.
Yeah. Okay. Next one, change the format. So this is basically do more games. Do more games, play across all 7 days. We won't touch on the business side of most things here, but let's just say from a performance point of view. So from the beginning of this discussion, this would help, right? More games would be better for lots of reasons, but also would be much better at identifying actual skill, because the bigger the sample size, the less randomness impacts the results.
Yeah.
Okay.
100%.
Great.
I think mathematically, right? Fact.
Yeah. Proven. Okay. That's that one then. Move the pseudo.
The quickest point we've ever made.
Yeah, we actually just completely agree. Good idea.
Yeah.
But
great.
But if you want to see why, see the first half an hour of the show. That's why.
Right.
Because you'd have less randomness. You'd have more based on skill, and also you'd have more practice. So the normal arguments actually are always about having more practice time, more stage time, which I think also all still true. But it is actually, based on the conversation we had, just better as well in the long term, because the team that wins is more likely to be the best team if there's more games. And so the teams that consistently win are actually the best and are actually doing stuff that's right. Whereas the fewer games there are, the more randomness there is, which is actually something I hadn't thought about really before today. So that's good.
Yeah.
Next one, move studio from Berlin to France or Spain. I think that's more about a business side of things. So we don't necessarily need to touch on that. Basically, esports, League of Legends is bigger in those places. Also, I do think Berlin, in a weird way, is a terrible place to have an esports facility, considering the average internet in Berlin compared to the average internet in France, for example, is a bit silly. Yeah. It's also the same in the UK, although the UK, I think, is still better than Germany now. Anyway, we won't go into all of that. So this one, again, I'm on board with, but it's not anything to do with lower the minimum age of the LEC age to 17. The reason it used to be 17, and the reason they increased it is because they wanted to allow 18 plus sponsors. So again, that's a business one, but I can answer why that's the case. And I don't think that's I'm sure someone's made that decision based on potential money versus potential. So I don't think, if you're going to say you have to be an adult, 18 is fine, I think, if it makes things easier from business side. Then the last point, which I think is important, and it comes back to what someone wrote in as a question or suggestion, which is I think the question we have here phrases it much better, but what it is in the tweet is clean up non-proactive orgs and staffs. Forget that. We won't dive into that because that was a wild one. Based on who's thought, but anyway, separate point. What was the comment in the YouTube, which I like much better, is there should be relegations. That cleans up your unproductive. It's not even unproductive, unproactive. That also could be the translation.
Yeah.
But anyway, you mentioned in the question, Riot would never give up the money, but actually in Valorant, that's what they do. They have a semi-open system. So I will definitely get this wrong because I'm not that into Valorant, but I think it's like semi-franchised. So they have partnered teams. They didn't buy in, actually. They just came to an agreement. And then they have a couple of slots that do change. So the partner teams maybe can't change, but the other ones can, or something. I can't remember. But basically, there's a small amount of promotion and relegation. So it is possible, while trying to keep it as stable as possible. Now, the advantage of dropping the second tier to 10 teams, the only possible advantage that I just thought of now is that could maybe then open for promotion relegation. So not if it's academies, but if you had a franchised instead, a wide franchised tier 2 that you could then promote into the tier 1 somehow, that would be useful. The massive problem that we had before franchising, because I was actually around doing stuff then, is that the EU LCS was much worse, actually, I would say, than the LEC was, at least for a while. So you'd think, okay, as soon as we have promotions, it will get much better because the better teams will come along and anyone can make a team and they can make the best team. And then if they're good enough, they'll get in, which is true. But the downside you have is that because there was such a big drop off between being in the EU LCS and being in any of the ERLs back then, like it was the ESL UK Premiership, for example, because that drop off was so big, organizations just literally could not take any risks on players. So there was loads of players who were in the EU LCS for a long time that were they were basically the players who were like, you're never going to win or even come close to winning with these players, but they're probably good enough to make you not get demoted. So for example, the first time we went to the LEC, there was loads of rookies. There was like 15 rookies for the first season of the LEC. And then there was like that kind of number for the first few years, because it was like, well, now finally we can take a gamble on these players we think are amazing, because if they're not amazing in the next 6 months, we're not going to have our entire business destroyed. So there was some advantages, although admittedly now esports has grown enough where I do think we can sustain a promotion relegation system. But I would just, as a defense for the franchising, I do think EU LCS was worse. It was just everywhere was worse. So we were maybe closer to the eastern regions, but we were also, the actual top was worse, a worse representation of the skill of the region.
Yeah. Yeah, certainly. Relegation promotion would be an incentive for teams to keep their performance support systems and staff as good as they can be. And I think you could, if you're locked into a league, you can easily just emphasize content and media and other things unrelated to performance, because you know you're going to have the big exposure anyway and the reach. If you might lose that based on performance, you're going to invest in the resources that support performance a bit more, and having those systems in place, you're more likely to foster talent that goes on to win. So I think having that, having that risk, if it will sort out the people that really care about it and want to foster winning talent, and give them an impetus or an incentive to actually go ahead and deliver on that. And I like the way it was phrased. It's just like the dead weight. Yeah. If you're not prepared to foster talent and put in the systems in place that ultimately do that, you're likely to drop off. And and that's right if we think that EU needs to be fixed.
And if you want to be more cynical even about it, I think it's really crazy that I literally put out a tweet last year, and I asked a bunch of people who would know, who are even more connected to these orgs than I am. Can you think of one moment where a GM or a head of LoL was fired for poor performance, and no one has any examples? They had a few where people stepped back, but from what I know, actually, in the cases that people said to me, like one person said to me, a certain person, they said they stepped back, but they actually got fired. And another person said, no, I was there. That person actually genuinely did want to stop, all these kind of things. So if the stakes were a bit higher and your head of LoL got you demoted, maybe we would actually see some change at the higher level, which I think is a bit... Maybe we do have the 10 best people in that position in Europe, but I would say because there's been no turnover since there's been so much turnover everywhere else, it's a bit suspicious to me, I would say, even if you look no further than that and you don't analyze any decisions or anything like that. So it could be that kind of thing is really useful, and it is a greater incentive to someone, and people mentioning Los Ratones a lot, obviously. It's a greater incentive for someone like Cagel to start a team, and maybe he would have done it earlier if he could get promoted. So you would have people more likely to come in and try it to see if they get promoted. But they might also come in, I mean, not Cagel, but other people might come in, try and get LEC, doesn't work, they leave. That also might happen as well. So I do think it would be a good idea, but I also can come up with good arguments the other side. It's not just like really clear in my head.
It would be, I think it would also be really interesting to figure out what works as well, because if it could be that a whole new approach to having a coaching staff constellation or setup, it could be like a whole new way of doing it that we're not thinking about. And if maybe one team just does that and then they rise through the ranks, it's like, oh, maybe there's something we can learn from that anomaly. But if everyone's locked and gets a bit fat and lazy, yeah. Anyway, it's an interesting argument, and I think I can see some benefit to fixing EU within that.
Okay. So let's keep it moving on, because I do want to touch on this age thing that you brought up before. Once we get to the other tweet, which was kind of a piggyback from what Zoki was saying, but this is from Duke, so someone who has been very heavily involved in the scene, has a lot of experience as a coach and as like a leader of projects, and has had a lot of success there as well. So his first point was: promote any influencer projects and incentives of this type. Public screenings are excellent. It may seem counterproductive, but it's the way forward. I think this is fantastic, although with some caveats. I think that it's kind of wild to me that we have, so far, organizations have not found any good ways to get value from the players that they're paying lots and lots of money. So even with us in sport, like ticket sales and obviously merch sales being a much bigger thing in general, you get money back from the players that you buy. Okay, you're not going to sell enough t-shirts to make it worth buying Ronaldo just plus minus, but you at least get some value back from buying him. Whereas you might get a couple of €100 for even getting someone like Caps, for example. And we have traditionally been very bad at getting value from our players. And so I think that if you could work out a way to introduce like stream scrims and that kind of thing, it really would be a good way to get like value back. So if you take Nord as an example, this split and last split have had massive rosters, and they've no one's being paid because the streams are doing the paying, or at least most of the people. Now, of course, I don't think that should be the way forward for most orgs, especially if you have the money to actually pay your players. But yeah, finding real good ways to actually get value back, I think is important and something that should be considered a lot, because we've spoken before about like the value of 10-man rosters and being able to fully control practice, or even if you take academy teams, right? Like academy teams, it's very hard to find extra value unless you're actually actively selling your players up into the higher divisions, which most people weren't able to achieve. But if you could stream your scrims and start to do some stuff there, then you can actually get some kind of value back. So I do genuinely think it's the future. I don't think it will be like we do it or LR do it, but I do think like 1 day a week of streaming our practice is a fantastic idea, and can be really useful for a huge amount of reasons, but not the least of which is like, let's get some actual value back from the assets, the players for the organizations.
Mm-hmm. So how does it link to saving EU talent development? I have one of our previous comments that might be relevant here would be, I do think so. I don't think esports is sport in a one-to-one relationship. I don't think it's exactly sport, and I think a key part of that is the fact that to survive in esports, there has to be some entertainment, digital content creation. That's part of it. I think coaches, for example, they have to put themselves out there and promote their work, and they have to create interesting content and engaging content. So there is like this digital elephant in the room in some sense, and this content elephant in the room. But so I actually found the team streaming scrims experiment really, really interesting, and I think it has breathed new life into a lot of projects, which has been fascinating to see. In terms of like purely talent development, I think it could be really interesting. But going back to one of our previous points, if we as a community could accept that the results in training or in player development should not matter quite as much as we seem to make them or talk about them. So if we could understand that scrims, we shouldn't be aiming to win every game in scrims, and we shouldn't judge players for not winning every game in scrims.
Yeah,
I think opening that up, I think is could be really interesting.
Yeah, I would say the way that it helps is how it fixes EU is 2 big things. The first is that it provides way more opportunities for businesses and stuff to be sustainable and successful. So you'll get more of them, and so it's better. If there's more money coming in, everything's better for the scene, or it should be.
Yeah.
But the next really, really big one is that it helps all the teams below you. I mean, I'll use LR as an example. Right. I won't use us, but I think the standard of European ERLs is probably far higher for the fact that coaches in Prime League 3 or the UKLC Div 2, which is like, can watch Casual stream and can watch LR scrim. They can watch the best team outside of the LEC, according to that one tournament with a tiny sample size. But they can watch the best team of the LEC do pretty much everything. And I think for a lot of teams, if you were in, just any league, like Prime 4, and you were scrimming a couple of nights a week, or like 3 or 4 nights a week, I think you're better off scrimming 2 nights a week and watching LR scrims together the other nights. And that's great. And that's just like, it's sharing knowledge. So everyone who's worse than them could probably gain something from watching their scrims. And also, just from a kind of coaching point of view, because it's all much more public, you can have a much better understanding of these players, how they are, make scouting better, all those kind of things. And also, if anyone starts doing anything new and interesting as a coach, you can if they do it in those situations, you can also then spread that. So one of the reasons
one
of the reasons I accepted the North position is that I've been doing this, like trying to support coaches and teach coaches and stuff, and it's great to have these in-depth discussions and talk about the theory a lot and what you kind of should do, but it's not as useful as just being able to show you like, this is what I do, and also this is where I completely mess it up, and this is where the theory completely falls apart because of you can see it happen and fall apart in front of my face. So I think that part is really, really big for me.
100% agree. Everything you said there resonated, and being able to look behind the curtain of what is good coaching and even decide from higher teams. And I know we probably shouldn't think about it in this way because this is where the concerns are more prevalent, but being able to see what a potential candidate for your team does as a coach, like how they operate, are they a good fit, being able to see behind just the performance of their team to make inferences about how good the coach is. So I think that's one of the big problems we've had in esports, is just how invisible the inner workings of a team and the coach are. So that would support better talent rising to the top of the pipeline. There is a caveat there about there is an ethical question there, and there is a psychological well-being question there. It is added pressure, conceivably, on some players. It is one of the big things that you try and work on if you're, for example, a sports psychologist and you're working with players, is you're trying to take the emphasis off the result and focus more on the process. And you're trying to make your evaluation more how you see yourself rather than how you think others see you. And by saying that we are streaming to an unknown global audience, you are inviting those thoughts to go to a perspective of like, well, who's judging me and what are they thinking? But if we could go beyond that with effective support systems, like, yeah, you could imagine it being really good for performance. So
one of
it's good for us to talk about, and then people can maybe learn from it, and then
yeah. I mean, one of the things that someone posted in the YouTube is like, what about the kind of basically when this goes too far, I think is your point. Let me know if I'm wrong, but you're talking about the kind of K-popification in the East a little bit of T1 spent a lot of money trying to keep this roster together, and they like branded them as like a specific team and tried to make them all stars, which I think is actually just good business, considering Faker won't be here forever. And there was this big drama, which is this person's reference, like the CEO made a public statement. They'd replaced one of the players for an up and coming academy player. And the CEO made a public statement saying, like, I talked to the coach and I said, we have to put Gumayusi back in. And it was really interesting because when I actually I saw it and had a specific thought, but then it was kind of confirmed to me because I was in a Discord call with a friend of mine who's a Premiership rugby player, and someone else came in. He's been involved in the Premiership for like 20 years or something. And the person said, like, oh, have you seen this? Like, it's absolutely ridiculous. And his instant reaction, the rugby player, was just like, guys, that's how sport works. Like, do you really think that only the people have played based only on like their skill? Like, this is just how sport works. So for me, the fact that they're playing Gumayusi over Smash, it's just how sport works, and that's how businesses work. And it's really unfortunate for Smash, but it's also just the way the world is. How well you perform is not the only thing that you should be judged. You are judged on. I think the massive error is tweeting about it, and that's wild to me. What happens in every other case is the coach says we're putting Gumayusi in, and when people ask, they say, oh, in practice he was performing really well again, so we wanted to give him another shot, or something like that. Like they just give us kind of bullshit answer and they toe the line, and that's what happens every other time that this has happened. But this happens all the time in sport. You just don't necessarily know it's happening.
Yeah, for sure. My point about the ethics is just going forward, as we start to see this as a benefit to the ecosystem of esports. I think we need to get better at informing players about what's going to happen. So as we start to build rosters on teams that are being streamed across the board, we need to make sure that players fully understand what that means. That means that on their bad days, people will see their bad days, and are they going to be all right with that? And are they informed about where to go? Maybe the team has access to a sports psych or a performance coach, or has a referral system that's like, are there measures in place to support players if they have a bad day on stream? And like, do they have options to opt out of being on stream one day, or can they maybe veto an on-stream session one day? Like, I think that's from a boring ethical perspective going forward. Yes, we want to stream and be entertaining, and that's probably good for talent development. But at the same time, people have rights, human rights and dignity. And if we force them into boxes and force them into exposing things they'd rather not expose, for example, poor performance, there are some grey areas there that just need to be figured out. And that's all, I think.
Okay, before we get on to Duke's next point, there was a really good question from someone in Twitch, which is someone who's really passionate about League, but not necessarily like a great player, not like super high elo. It feels incredibly unreachable to get into the competitive scene, even though I might have other valuable talents. So, would a way to help fix EU be improving the pipeline for backroom staff and a way to kind of get in and get more involved? Because at least from my point of view, being involved in the coaching scene, it's like every year there's way more coaches, but there's not more teams. In fact, there's less teams. So what do we do? Something's not going to work there. So yeah, like it's obviously all the like resources and stuff about how to get better. But even if you are good enough, let's say there's people watching this who would be one of the top 40 coaches in Europe in League of Legends, which could well, just because you're not doesn't mean, just because you're not currently in one of the top 40 teams doesn't mean you're not one of the top 40 best coaches, is what I was trying to say. Is some way of improving the backroom route, is that a big thing for you? And if so, how might we do that? Because I think the first question is easy. I think we both agree yes. But the second question, have you got any ideas?
Undoubtedly, if we could make it a bit more structured for motivated, talented people to do jobs in sort of coaching and things like that, like undoubtedly that's a good thing. Increasing opportunity. There's a lot of forces outside of the performance and talent space that are needed to do that. So we'd need an almighty uptick in viewership at lower ERL levels that invites.
But even to get involved in ERLs, it's hard. How do you get involved in ERLs? And I'm happy to answer any questions I know about, but I have no idea because I didn't ever try to be involved in ERLs. Like esports wasn't a thing that you would try to do when I started it because it wasn't a thing. So I started coaching. I've told the story many times. I started coaching in League of Legends by accident. I did some coaching in coaching qualifications in rugby and football, but I was at a tournament. We got knocked out. A friend of mine hadn't been knocked out, and I'd been watching some League. That was the only thing that was weird because it was like season 1 or 2, and no one really watched League. And I just started messaging him some things, like maybe consider this, maybe consider that. And then he was like, can you just do that again for next game? So I did. And he was like, can you just come over to our seats and just do that? And so I did. And it wasn't, I was doing that for ages before, like for like months and months before. I was like, wait, I'm kind of coaching in this. Like, this is weird. Like, this is a computer game. Not only am I watching other people play a computer game at points, but I'm also telling other people to play a computer game who are all better than me how to do it. And yeah, so I don't know how you even, if I started from zero, I have no idea how I would get involved in the RL scene. I mean, I guess I would say find what you want to do and message as many of the appropriate organizations for that thing as possible. If you want to get involved in coaching, find some place to coach, or just coach people. Like any like gold team or whatever will teach you a lot about how to coach, even if you're way better than that. That will also still teach you how to coach, and you can start from there. Like practical experience is the best teacher for sure. How we would improve how you get involved in that system, I think now we're talking about coaching qualifications and stuff like that. If we stick specifically to coaching, and that is probably too big a topic for part of this discussion, considering we have more discussion to go and we're an hour and a half in.
I can chime in briefly on that though, because I'm writing a paper on exactly that right now for my PhD, which is the role of coaching qualifications in esports. And it's based on some data that we've collected. And to link to like what we know about sport is that coaches develop across, there are different sources that contribute to your learning and development as a coach. Qualifications and certifications are some of those sources of learning, but by far the most amount of learning that you will do, the most amount of time you spend in a learning environment as a coach will be either being coached yourself or observing and working alongside another coach. And that's not to say that's actually better or worse than the coaching qualification or certification. It's just you will spend more time in those other environments. And so if you want to get involved as a coach in esports, you should, and you're not a player who has a natural way of networking and experiencing coaching, you should look to work alongside coaches and learn the craft a little bit and be useful. And that was how I started. I got involved with the UKLC team in 2020. This is actually a bit of a lie because that's not where I started. I started by being lucky. I was in a room with someone who was the performance coach at Misfits, who invited me to then go and give a workshop to his coaches at Rogue. But in terms of my first role was with a UKLC team. It was voluntary, and I sought to be useful and understand it and observe and work alongside. And that was a huge source of learning, and then provide value where I could, which happened to be more in the sort of holistic performance space. So, but the problem is, there's no guarantee. Like you've alluded to, there aren't many coaching spots that pay at the moment, and might not be for a few more years. But we are seeing an emergence in things like national teams and things like that. So
you definitely need to be open to not being paid. And again, we didn't skip that getting in early. It was a bigger thing. I wasn't paid in esports for don't know how many years of coaching when I was just doing other things on the side. I remember at one point I had an offer for a team that was going to pay me £50 a month. And this was after like maybe at least 2 years of coaching. And it was like wild. I was so blown away by that whole thing.
Awesome.
Because before it was like you get a jersey if you're lucky. that was always the thing.
There is one great example though. I see that Robin Copain in the Twitch chat, who raised this point. A really nice example as well is Path over at Sido in the States. So Path Nadu, he started as an analyst, but he didn't. He started putting out analytical work in League of Legends. So he published numerous, I think, videos about his take on certain games, and then it got seen, and he rose all the way up to general manager in the LCS. So I think we in esports there is this need to put out content online, and you need to get comfortable at that, and you need to be good at that. And it is you see coaches rising up through the ranks because of having a decent online profile, online presence, and online output. And I think that is part of it.
Yeah.
If you can prove to teams that you can do that
and make content, like if you think your strength is analyzing the game, then analyze games and put it out online. And see what happens, and you'll always get better as well. I think Ollie has a great suggestion from YouTube. Maybe ERL could try hosting non-professional tournaments, and if you win, you get information and tips, or you qualify for an internship, or all those kind of things. I think that kind of thing could absolutely have a lot of potential. I know MasterCard have done some stuff with G2 about to do with like being involved in esports. So there are things out there, but it's not easy, and you do need a lot of luck. And I think the best piece of advice that I've ever heard on filmmaking, how to become a filmmaker, is probably the same thing that I would say to coaches. And the advice is from a guy called Mark Duplass, who says, keep making shit shorts until one of them doesn't suck. So just keep producing. So this is for films. Just keep producing short films, and they'll be terrible, and then you'll get better at them. So I would say the same thing for coaching. So don't put too much emphasis. Someone mentioned a portfolio. I would say don't put loads of thought into a portfolio if you're starting out. I would just coach teams. And if you're way better than them, who cares? If they're way better than you, who cares? Just coach teams, and you'll coach them terribly, and just keep doing that until you feel like you coached them well, and then hopefully you'll kind of go from there. But that would be my overall advice. But it does take a big chunk of luck. Okay, we keep getting distracted. The great points, but we do keep getting distracted. So next one, which I think I wanted to get to because I think it's a bit contentious. Next point from Duke: head of esports or general managers should be former pros, coach or player, because they manage the recruitment of staff and sometimes even players. And in his opinion, competitive experience is a huge advantage in this situation. So,
Ooh. Okay. Let's take this route. We know that to be an effective leader in an environment and to inspire followers and to communicate effectively, you have to be able to speak their language. And so familiarity with a context is fairly critical to be able to speak the same language as the people that you are setting out to lead and inspire. So for someone that's running an esports team or coaching a team, familiarity with that context would appear to be highly useful to be able to get to get the people following you in the right way, understanding what you want, for you to understand them and their needs, so on and so forth. Do you only get that from being a high level player yourself? I would contest no. So I'm mixed on that part of it. And otherwise, what skills do you develop as a professional player that are necessary for those leadership and coordination and management roles? I can't say with any certainty. There is a huge overlap there. So I would say that essential, I would disagree with. And I think that, yeah.
Okay, that part I can at least agree with. Like essential, I think is too much. And I'm very biased by the fact that this is the role that I want to do, and I think I wouldn't be able to do it anywhere near as well if I hadn't been a coach. But I do think there's a very good point here, which is that currently the people who are running these projects seem to not really have that much knowledge or any knowledge about competitive high performance. So a lot of times they're people who are very business focused, and they're people who are coming in more like laterally, where you were head of something else in another company and now you're head of LOL in an esports organization. Whereas if you compare that to someone like, Simon Cox, someone that I've spoken to on the Coach Talk podcast, absolutely fantastic, who was a director of Olympic programs, having been involved in the Olympics himself. That's, I think, more the kind of profile that would be absolutely not necessary, but I think would be a great step forward. So it doesn't have to be League of Legends or anything like that, but competitive high performance, I think there is a real lack of knowledge about that stuff at the higher levels at the moment. And so this is the part that I massively agree with the point he's trying to get at, but I don't think you should like disqualify someone because they haven't been a player, especially because you're right. I do think coaching teaches you a lot of the skills that you would need in that role, but I don't see how player teaches you almost any of them. But I do think it's important to have people who are more focused on that side of things in higher roles, thinking about long-term stuff. So maybe it's maybe not even a role that exists. Maybe it's not called general manager, because all of this depends on the sport. Like the manager in football would probably be the head coach. In rugby would probably be the general manager, maybe be the general or the coach. Like it's all different in everything different. So I don't think I think the point that he's trying to make, which I do really agree with, is that the people who are running these kind of things, especially people who are able to be thinking about the longer term, the next like 5 years, should be people who have experience of like competitive high performance and have really focused on that thing, and less people who are, I was a manager at a company doing head of something, and head of LOL is therefore the same as head of brand management for someone else, like, and that part I do really agree with, because it's so important. And I think this is the part that we're the worst at of all the positions compared to like the East, for example. And in Korea, normally, as far as I'm aware, at least, the head coach in almost everywhere, I definitely know for sure in a lot of places, but maybe everywhere, is someone who is more like a sort of, well, this role, and they're called the head coach. So at the moment, there are, Roman does it at G2, or Matt kind of does it as the head coach at Vitality, you know, all these kind of things. So we're sort of getting a bit of it from different places and people who are doing other roles as well. And I think putting a little bit more focus on this role, like I said, this role that has had potentially zero turnover or zero forced turnover, I think that part is important.
Yeah, I'm with you on a lot of there. I reject this. We value experience way too much for me. So, like, we complain now, but actually, those people that have been in those roles for so long now have the most experience in those roles. So surely they should be the best at them if experience is so good. And it's just clearly not. Like, what we mean when we talk about experience is that we assume they have developed the right set of skills. So then the question is, well, where do we find the right set of skills? Not where do we find the person with the most experience. So, you know, like what we're actually what we're not doing well at articulating is that we assume that the player that has been a winning elite level player has experience of making the best decisions under pressure when it matters, and that's what we want in this management coach role. But actually, it's like there are surely other ways to find those skills. So don't just rely on someone having done it or been in the environment where that's happening. So I get a bit cautious about that.
Maybe the better way to think about it is instead, the person even above that should realize that whoever is taking the shape and direction of the project should also have some of these skills. You know, is that a better way to kind of phrase it? They should have some skills that are like they should have a full understanding of a direct competitive space. And I would say, as an example, part of that full understanding should be that randomness plays a huge role in results. Whereas, like, if you're the top company selling your thing, like if you've been in charge of a project that's a company that's selling more and more of whatever their product is, you're doing great. But in a competitive high performance where it's like a zero-sum game, if you win, the other person loses, you could be staying the same or even going down and doing great if everyone else is, you know, getting even better, or like those kind of things. Like being fully aware of all that kind of stuff, I think, is really important. And I guess actually the thing for me that about this point is more that even it should exist. And I think it doesn't really even exist. I think mostly people called general manager and called head of LOL are there responsible for the business side of things. And someone does need to be responsible for the business side of things, but someone also needs to be a role with someone who can think 5 years on the performance side of things. And I don't think any team really has that. If people have been there for 5 years, it's 2 years and 2 years and 2 years, you know, like obviously that makes 6, but you know what I mean?
Yes. No, I'm with you on that. In a way, I feel kind of sorry for them because it's not sorry for them. That's a bit condescending. I didn't mean that. It's more that I feel we're all, in a way, still very pioneering in making sense of this. And as I've said repeatedly, we don't know exactly what we don't know all the critical pieces of the puzzle for performance in any game. Because it is so new and so different, and so the head of performance role is kind of making decisions on, or the head of esports or general manager or whatever. They're making decisions based on a bit of trial and error, and that has taken time. And I think there is scope for improvement. It's difficult, but I would agree with your last sentiments there. Yeah.
I think as well it can help with the fact that a big problem we have a lot of times is very siloed things, and that's quite often because coaches, and some of them are public about this, but I still won't say who, are basically like, I've never met a head of LOL or whatever who I actually wanted to have around. Like I would rather just interact with them as little as possible.
That's brutal.
That then, for me, that's what needs to change. You know, you need to have a head of LOL that your head coach is like, I'm desperate to have him. Don't send him to this business thing that's really important because we need him here. That's what you want, or like that's the main thing for me. Like we just need to change that, because that is something is going very wrong when that's quite regularly the case. Or it's like, okay, again, I won't say who, coaches trying to learn how to talk to business people because the person who's actually deciding what players they're allowed to have can't communicate with them. And so they need to write these like businessy documents that are not written from a business point of view well, because why would that coach ever know how to write a 50-page document about business stuff? And why do they need to? Surely it should be a person who's bridging both of those gaps, who then, if like the board needs to see the business document or needs to have the business meeting, you shouldn't need to bring your head coach to that because it's skills that the head coach doesn't need. Whereas there should be someone there who's able to kind of do both those things. So, it's like the Brailsford of esports is what I say a lot. Like that's the role that we need.
So are you saying that the head of LOL or the head of esports or that figure, are you saying we should reconceptualize the role, or that experience in the coaching and playing environment doesn't matter?
I'm saying that there should be someone who is in charge of making long-term decisions who also has a full knowledge of high performance stuff. So I actually also don't think that as a player you get a full knowledge of, I don't know, necessarily as a coach you get full knowledge either. But my point is that the person in that role should have knowledge of high performance. What I would say, competitive high performance, I'll say again, I know I'm well aware that business can also be very high performing. What I will say though is that if you were going to have blanket fixes, this would be a better one than not having it. That's what I believe. I think if you're hiring for this role that I've made up and doesn't actually exist, but if let's say every org had this role and genuinely wanted their general manager or head of esports to actually be someone who was doing the things that I think are important to make EU great, I think you would be better off only looking at people who had competitive experience of themselves than, for example, only looking at people who didn't.
Yeah.
But I don't think any coach would do this role well. And I definitely don't think any player would do this role well. And I think we're talking about fractions of percentage of players would do this well. And maybe single digit percentage of coaches would do this well in esports at the moment.
And I don't think that's a condemnation of players or coaches as
no, it's just
they have a hard job and they are experts in that role.
Yeah,
it's a
completely different role. In the same way that I don't think all players make good coaches, even let alone this role that's further away from the game, further away from. So I think a lot of them do, but not even, again, probably not even much beyond double-digit percentage of players I think make good coaches, but the ones that do can be incredibly good coaches.
Yeah. I think someone like yourself, John, would fulfill the role brilliantly, and teams should pick you up. Also, because you bring like a diversity of skills to the table, and we know that a lot of what you do is also very valuable to orgs, namely production of digital content. So you could shape that as well with first-hand experience. So.
I'll send this rant as my, like, we're talking about building a portfolio before. I'll just send them this rant where I say we're doing it terribly. Everyone needs to be fired.
Yeah, this could be one of your shorts that's not terrible. This is one of your this is one of your shorts that hits the mark.
Okay. So we'll move on to the next point. But actually, I think, to be honest, this point is less about like coaching and stuff and more about the game specifically. But he's saying we should have a way to like incentivize taking solo queue very seriously. So at the moment, someone is running a sort of challenge to see who can get the highest elo, and you get a prize for it. Doing something like that would be good. I mean, Riot has tried it multiple times, Champions Queue, and every split Champions Queue was going to give you a reward for being the top ranked player. Something like that could be good. Just more competitive solo queue would be good. I was actually talking to someone about this recently. They had their analyst look at the winners of the LEC, like the average or combined solo queue, and basically the top is pretty clear and the bottom is pretty clear. Like the teams that come 1 or 2 are, over the last 5 years, have always been the teams with the highest combined solo queue LP, and the teams that come 9th and 10th have always been the bottom. So the lowest has
Interesting.
always been either 9th or 10th, and the highest has either been 1st or 2nd. But the middle is really unclear. And
Interesting.
it's quite funny because it's like one of those, there's that meme where you have like the inverted U kind of graph. And it's like when you're a rookie or completely new to something, you think this. And then when you get kind of good, you think the
Yeah.
opposite. And then when you get very good, you think, that's been my journey for solo queue. It's like solo queue is really important when you haven't started. And then when you've been coaching for like 5 years, it's like solo queue doesn't matter. And now I'm like, okay, solo queue is really important.
Yeah.
So having competitive solo queue would be great, I think. And it would be much better to bring talent through, whether that's through incentives and money or through some other reason, or maybe once you do some incentives and money, then everyone takes it more competitively and therefore, et cetera, et cetera. The other thing, of course, that's very important to say is not all players, that's not a blanket statement that every player needs to be high elo. For example, we just had Treats, who doesn't really play solo queue very much, and his best splits and his best years were ones where he didn't play at all and just played 20,000 ARAMs and watched loads of VODs. Yeah. And that was his thing. So he was, and actually kind of being quite intentional around that. Like, okay, the two things I need are mechanics and knowledge about matchups in the game. And I get better knowledge and matchups about the game from VODs, and I get better mechanics from just spamming ARAMs. So he was actually being quite intentional about how he's learning. But the point is that it's not necessarily blanket true for everyone, but more competitive solo queue would be useful.
But yeah, potentially this flags to me maybe once again that actually we are not there yet. We haven't reached the ceiling for how to train for League of Legends.
Oh, 100%. I don't think we're close to the ceiling.
So, like, I think back to like early days of the NBA, where you've got like the origins of basketball. Like you see old grey footage of players running around in tiny shorts, long socks, and Converse All Stars. Right? It feels like we're a bit like there, and actually we know what basketball can be today, and you see players shooting from all over the court, and incredible dribbling skills and things like that. It kind of feels a bit like if solo queue is that important, but it's not the same as the game. Like solo queue is not the same as official in terms of the intentions of the players, mentality of the players, the way the game is played, the way teams communicate. If that is representing itself as quite critical in determining who finishes top of the league, it kind of shows to me that we're not training effectively. That would be my takeaway. So it means that there is like we're far from the ceiling in terms of how effectively we train. So that's
working
I'm
out better
struck
training
by that.
methods. Yeah.
Who knows what they are actually?
I
honestly,
have no idea. And again, it could be that it's like the training methods we have are not good, but they're the scrims are the worst way to practice, just ahead of all the other ways. I already said that on this podcast, but I'm going to do it again.
Gosh, doesn't that suggest that scrims aren't? That is really fascinating.
I don't think scrims are a very effective way to practice either, and I think scrim VOD reviews are even less. I've said this before, and I still think I stand by it. Maybe it's getting better, but I think like at least 60, if not 70% of scrims are lost just based on like people not understanding their role in the game, and learning as a group like that is kind of silly. I think not silly, but can't be the best way to do it. So who knows?
Thanks.
Anyway, that's just the standard structure we have of scrim, 20-minute review, scrim, 20-minute, that kind of thing. Okay. So before we get on to the EMEA Masters and the age discussion, which will have to be somehow fairly quick on, considering I'm more, it's already an hour and 43 minutes. Are there any other short things that come to mind for ways that we can come up with to fix or improve EU? How should we fix EU? I had something that I've thought of as we're going through the podcast, and I've completely spaced on what it is. So if it comes to me, I'll say it. But other than that,
I'll ramble for. I can fill for a second.
Do it.
So from the traditional sports setting, a lot of research into this. We know that effective talent development environments are characterized by a long-term development focus, quality preparation, effective communication throughout the organization, but also with individual players. So what is expected of you while you're here, how we're going to evaluate you, understanding the athlete, so understanding what that athlete needs to actually take the next step, an effective support network. So we have specialist performance staff, and they are available to you to achieve this, that, and the other. A challenging and supportive environment. So there's high expectation, but also we give you all the support we think is necessary for you to meet those expectations. And long-term development fundamentals, which I suppose aligns with this long-term development focus. That's going to be the ethos around our talent development environment. So if we're trying to fix EU in terms of winning more on the international stage, we presumably want to focus on developing better talent that then goes on to represent us. So maybe, for me, no quick fix there, but we probably need spaces where there is a longer term development focus. So maybe an academy team that is signed for 2 years, maybe, who knows? I think one thing is the understanding of the individual athlete, so not treating every player the same, trying to create an environment where staff actually get to grips with what that individual might need to really get the best out of them in the game, and over the long term, not just for a split, because we want them to go on to represent, so they presumably have to be in the system for a number of years. Yeah, it's complex. I think it's really complex. In that filler, did anything come to mind for you? Do you recall anything?
No, I mean, I think still it's just all this more of a focus on longer term stuff and that kind of thing. I think we have touched on all the things that I think are the most important. I'll just say as an example, which I've used before, the Shai, who's a very good player, who's Korean, but played in China his whole life. And the reason he played in China is because when he was 13, he was recruited by IG to be in their youth team, to move to Beijing or wherever it was, I can't remember, and play there. And then in 3 years, he was then able to play in tournaments, and actually then went on to win Worlds with them, or 4 years or something, which already sounds impressive. And you're like, oh, okay, right, that's a bit of a longer term thinking approach than we took necessarily in the West. And then you realize that they won Worlds, and his first competitive year was in like 2017 or something like that, which means that when they recruited a player from another country to bring them there for 4 years to practice with our team so that in 4 years he'd be good, league was like season 4 or something like that. And the idea of us doing that now in season 15 in Europe, we're going to work with someone who in a few years will be good. It seems like we've only got 1 August even remotely considering that kind of approach. And this was happening in season 3. People were saying this esports thing is going to be a big deal. And so we're going to recruit a player and have them stream and play. So yeah, I think that's really interesting. I think we need to do a lot more focus on longer term things. I think we do a lot more bridging the silos in esports organizations, which includes finding a way to monetize the players in a better way. That sounds a bit of a weird way to say it, but it's like that is effectively for me bringing media and performance much closer together. I think that we need to take a longer term approach with how we're setting up performance structures. And I think we just need to be a lot more smart about where we're drawing knowledge from and drawing a lot more knowledge from traditional coaching and stuff like that than we currently do. Obviously, the biggest one for me is we should treat coaches like performers, and we should support them. And
that's a good one for the show.
Yeah, exactly. We'll pretend I'll edit this, so I put it at the beginning. Yeah, because I think there's a huge amount of value there. I actually made a little video that I sent to orgs saying like, coaching your coaches is the best value for money spend in esports, which I think is definitely still the case, because most coaches got to the top level without having anyone ever help them. Think of the example of this head of esport thing where I said several coaches have even publicly said, for heads of esports, I'd just like to see them as little as possible. Whereas if the person who's the head of esport was actually coaching them and made them better at their job, they would presumably want to see that person more, or at the very least, someone genuinely supporting them. So for me, that's a really, really big part of it. And we just don't think of coaches as performers. We also see them as static. So it's like how good you were there is how good you will be. Whereas we've finally got to terms with the fact that players could get better, but not coaches. Although players can only get better up to a certain age, of course, as we all know.
Yeah, right.
From after 22, that's how good you are. So at 32,
Fixed.
you will be that good, and you'll be that kind of teammate as well.
Yeah, bingo. I mean, I'm a broken record when it comes to let's support coaches for numerous reasons. It's going to benefit, I think, a lot of the ecosystem in Europe and beyond. Alternative off the wall idea as well is increase the talent pool. So maybe, and this is a little bit a serious one actually, if we had better coaches, not better, that's the wrong way of saying it. If we had coaches that were more equipped to deal with things like toxicity, and we make League this wonderful experience at all levels, we increase the talent pool, we increase the participation, we then increase the likelihood that we're going to strike gold in terms of talent. So I think that's kind of connected. Like if coaches are equipped to deal with, or equipped to bring, good energy to coaching environments and give people motivation and inspiration to invest in their performance and work hard and try and break through the ranks and stick with it and demonstrate positive behaviors in that process, we could uncover new talent and increase an influx of new talent, and that is probably part of the puzzle there as well. But yeah, your point, let's support our coaches and put them in environments to succeed and develop. Yeah.
Okay, so let's move on. We'll have to touch on it briefly because I don't think it's appropriate to wait and do a whole episode on it, unless you think there is this idea that it's bad for EU that Los Ratones won EMEA Masters. And talking about age and esports. We touched on it briefly before. So the reason, and people had some suggestions in the chat about fixing EU, but they were about changing the game. I think that is actually a really interesting discussion, but the problem is that then they'll also have that in Korea and they'll probably take better use of it. So stuff like coaches being involved during the game as communicated with F1. I think the best thing if you want to make coaches have a way bigger impact is giving us save states. But like I said, those would be tools that everyone was using. So we were just talking about the systemic things here. So do you want to touch on this stuff about people saying it's a tragedy that Los Ratones won EMEA Masters and stuff like that?
I don't fully get the argument, honestly. Well, I don't. I just don't.
Okay. Let me try. So
yeah,
in the past, we have seen that players who are really good in, let's say, season 3, when they get older, I'm going to just phrase it like that and I'll poke holes in my own argument later. When they get older, they're often overtaken in skill, or have always been in League of Legends, always, because it's been going for at least a few years. So we can say things like always. They've been overtaken in skill by younger players who are coming up. So the best players in season 3 were not as good as the best players in season 4 and 5. And other than a few exceptions, we'll just say that's the case, and we'll just pretend we're just taking up until caps. The best player in EU was always younger than the current best player. Therefore, if the tier 2 is just old players, that means we've got no young players coming through, and players who are over 25. That part I don't even have a fake argument that I can come up with. We don't want them to go into the LEC because once they're in the LEC for a few years, there'll be these older players who are always usurped by younger players. Don't know. That's the best I can do. I do think it's based on a fundamental misunderstanding of human beings. If you think that firstly, League of Legends is a very reaction-based game, and secondly, that your reaction time slows when after you hit 25, you're on a downhill slope of reaction time significantly. Let's pretend that those things are true. Then would it be bad? This is my point, is that even if all those things were true, which they're not, I still don't understand why it would be bad. Because if they're the best players, they would win. So who cares?
Yeah, I don't understand how it can be construed as showing that the next generation of talent is poor and so on and so forth. And I think, who knows? It could be that the optimal career progression for the European version of Faker, it could be the optimal career progression we just haven't seen yet. And maybe it involves going up, coming down to bounce back up to the top and be, to have those experiences and to learn from that rocky road, so to speak. And so I don't think it's bad. Let's not overthink it. A win for the region is a win for the region, and we get to examine what went into that.
I mean, I think for me, the fact that they won shows more about the mismanagement and stuff we've been speaking about before, that these players who have been unbelievably good for a long time and haven't been on the top teams because of maybe nonsense reasons, or because the teams are not appealing enough. So we couldn't attract, the top teams didn't want him and the bottom teams couldn't attract someone like Nemesis to the LEC. I think both of those things could potentially be a problem. The second one definitely is a problem, that we don't have
Right.
10 encouraging places of our top 10 teams, which is always going to be hard, to be fair, because the 10th team is always going to look bad because you're coming 10th. So it doesn't matter if it's a fantastic place to be, they take great care of the players and all that kind of thing. If they come 10th, you'll still look bad on that team. So it's never going to be that all the places are more appealing. And that's not the case in LCK or anywhere like that. Christian has a good question from the chat. When does cognitive skills decrease? Do you know? You spoke about it a little bit before, but do you want to do a quick summary again?
It's a constellation of skills and cognitive functions that we have. And so within that constellation, you have things that are more motor skill related. So things like reaction time, response time, things like that. Yes, they might decrease. I thought it was early 30s. I don't think it is early mid 20s. I think it's more in the 30s based on the research I'm vaguely recalling. But what's I think really interesting is more to look at what's directly relevant for performance in league in a team game, not a solo queue game, but in a team environment. Things like emotion regulation, which actually increases with age in our late or mid 30s onwards, and things like inhibition. So are we able to resist urges to do certain erratic behaviors? That increases with age, and that kind of makes sense, right? We are a little bit impulsive in our youth. And we learn to work through that and control and exercise things that are relevant for league.
Which is also a ridiculous reason why it's hilarious that people think players can't get better when they get older. Yeah. I was talking to someone literally yesterday who was about to join a team, but then the general manager stopped it because they'd seen them have a big fight with their coach at an event. And it was like, we don't want that kind of player. And like, okay, wow. Firstly, did you talk to the coach? And they hadn't. And when was the event? 7 years ago. And okay. So maybe they might be a slightly different person when they were 20 to now they're nearly 30. Or even we might be slightly different people because actually you have better emotional control and you've had a lot more experiences. Exactly. And so it's weird that we think when someone's and it's just these random arbitrary ages that are so wild. So someone said we don't want to send people who are above 26 to the LEC. And my first question with those kind of things is always okay, but why 26? Why not 27 or 25? How have you arrived at this number, for example? And what we have a lot is that sorry, I did the same thing I was saying to not do. I started reading the chat while I was talking. But we have this perception that, okay, when you come in as a really young player, 18, and then the first few years, you can get much better. And then after that, you're not allowed to get better anymore. It's okay, from 18 to 20, you can get better. But then from 20 to 25, you're that level. And there's so many older players now who have this real problem joining teams because it's oh no, I played with this guy 5 years ago and he was this good. Or
Yeah.
they joined the LEC and didn't do very well in the LEC. It's like, okay, 5 years ago they were in the LEC. They're quite different now, and they could be much better. But we don't know that. And so if they change their name, maybe they'd have a better shot at it.
Yeah.
But yeah, it's ridiculous.
I think it's also I could imagine these are artifacts from the.
100%. By the way,
I think people have worked backwards from the facts. So there aren't many players older than 22, let's say, in the LEC. That might be a bit young, but there aren't many players. There aren't many players of 26 and older in the LEC, and they've worked backwards. And then you say, well, it's because of cognitive decline. They can't function at that level anymore. When in fact, I would contest, and this has been my belief for a while, that it's just other life circumstances that reduce 100%. Your ability to do it.
Yeah,
right?
It's like
you have a relationship.
Yeah, that's, choosing new things. Exactly. Yeah,
exactly. Maybe we know that a lot of players in the UK, for example, they play a lot at university. So 18 to 21, they reach a high rank. They leave uni. They got to get a job.
Yeah.
So they don't have the time.
Yeah.
And it's like we retroactively explain those facts by biological reasons, which just is a bit. Let's move on.
And also, even more simply, when we're in season 2 and 3, there were far less people playing the game and far less people interested in being good in esports.
Yeah.
And so the people who are the best are likely to be not as good as the people who are the best. Like if 100 people played League of Legends and we took the top 20 players and put them on 4 different teams, they would not be very good, probably, compared to the fact that now however many million people or tens of millions of people play in Europe, now the top players are good. And so the new players who are coming up ousted the older players, but the older players were there because it was less competitive to be there. You know, like when people argue like, what's the hardest sport? And I think it's quite interesting to have that discussion, just of like, you know, we talk about luck and all this kind of thing. But in reality, I would say the answer is fairly simple from an actual real world standpoint. It's the one that most people play. It's harder to be the best football player than it is to be the best anything else, because more people play football. And it's the same in this. So again, it's just my favorite player from season 3, when they got to about 25, there was really good 20-year-olds. It's like, yeah, but the 20-year-olds were the top selection of millions of people, and the 25-year-old was the top selection of hundreds of thousands of people. So of course they're not as good. But now it's been about the same amount of people for the last, whatever it is, 10 years. There's no reason for that to continue. So again, it's another just artifact of the way that the system was.
Yeah. What's frustrating for me is that I can't point to a scientific article on this because we haven't done it yet. But one day I'm hoping that we can point to a full controlled randomized control trial in a sort of lab setting that highlights that the senior players perform just as well in certain metrics with the same amount of background training and things like that. They just chose not to play because of life factors. Like that's kind of what I'm looking for, but we can't do it yet. But I don't think it's it's just something that we should just try and ignore if we want to develop the region, because there might be players that between 20 and 25, after they've left the academy, maybe between 20 and 25, they didn't have an opportunity in esports anymore and they had to go out and do something else. And then at 25, maybe they found new life circumstances, and then they could go back as a new person, train and reach beyond what they achieved before. So I don't think it's useful. Like it's got to be case by case basis at the moment because we don't know.
Yeah, and I think we'll stop this discussion here because it's been a long time. I think Ollie in YouTube summed up kind of perfectly from just the talking of physical factors. Again, even if you think that League of Legends is incredibly reaction-based, I don't think the most rabid League of Legends fan would think it's more reaction-based than something like F1 driving, for example. And Alonso is 43 and he's still driving F1. And whenever they measure their reaction times, they're always faster than any other sport even. You know, even just simple, stupid things like dropping the ruler. You can literally compare, like just type in reaction speed of F1 drivers. It's wild how quickly they react because they have to drive these cars the way they do. And yeah, there's a 43-year-old doing it now. There's been world champions who are way older than world. Yes, there is new young players, young drivers coming up, of course, but there are also people who are well beyond 25. Most people, I think probably still most people are well beyond 25, and there are people who are still doing it at older than any esports player by miles. And if you look at that and think like, well, you won't be, it's impossible to be good at League after like 35, I think you just don't understand League of Legends or people, really.
Yeah.
So we'll keep it there. We'll stop it there. I mean, there are some other points of that discussion which I think are a little bit more interesting, but I think it's probably not worth going into now. I think, like you say, best approach is to have fun discussing it, but other than that, just ignore it and just keep doing things as if it doesn't exist.
I'll try and have a look for a couple of studies to post in comments about the relative decline or improvement in certain cognitive functions, because it's interesting and it's not hard to get to grips with the work. So I'll look for some studies to post, and I'll post that YouTube video that we stumbled across about luck and skill.
Sure, great. So, well, that's going to be it then. So thanks everyone for watching, and thanks for participating this time. And we will see you maybe not next week because I've just found out we've got scrims, but at some point.
At some point in the future. Brilliant. Well, yeah, thanks, John. Really engaging chat, and thanks